So as we just heard, tensions are escalating between Israel and Iran after President Trump called for Tehran's unconditional surrender, but Iran vowed to continue to fight. For more on how the situation in the Middle East will unfold, we're joined by Dr. Robert Lawrence, senior researcher at the Institute of Middle East and African Affairs. Dr. Lawrence, thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So why did Israel attack Iran just days before U.S. and Iranian negotiators were set to meet for nuclear talks? What's behind Israel's decision?
So Israel's likely been planning this since their campaign against Iran last April and October. During that aerial campaign, they were able to knock out all of Iran's S-300 anti-aircraft systems. So Israel saw itself in an advantageous position and likely assessed that it had escalation superiority because of aerial dominance. Now, it's important to understand the timeline here. You know, the U.S. had been signaling for weeks that it was unhappy being strung along with Iranian negotiations, that a deal needed to be made, real progress needed to be made, or else there would be other methods used. And it was really losing faith in the utility of the negotiations. So, you know, then on June 12th, the 35-nation member Board of Governors of the IAEA, they actually declared that Iran was in breach of its non-proliferation obligations. So at this point, Iran decides to double down. They say that they're going to set up a new enrichment facility at a secure location and replace the older centrifuges with the sixth generation, more modern ones. So at this point, I think the U.S. didn't see Iran taking negotiations seriously and no longer objected to Israel's use of force.
Right, and how likely is U.S. involvement in the war? And if it does decide to join, what might that look like?
Well, you know, President Trump prefers to keep people guessing. You know, his strategic ambiguity gives him more room to adjust his direction as he sees fit. But this also causes confusion amongst friends and foes alike. So, you know, this is done by design. The likelihood of the U.S. actually getting involved is tough to predict, but I will say there's an awful lot of firepower being brought into the region right now. There's a third carrier strike group on the way. So preparations for involvement are certainly in place. But it's also highly controversial amongst his domestic opposition and within his own MAGA movement. What would it actually look like? I think it's very unlikely you're going to see boots on the ground. There's no political will to do something like that. It would probably come through the air. A lot of people are talking about using GBUs or bunker buster bombs to hit the Fordo nuclear facility, which is located under a mountain. That could be the case, but you know, consequences of direct U.S. Involvement are extremely dangerous for our regional allies, U.S. forces in the region, domestic security, and the global economy. So I think he's probably leveraging the threat of U.S. involvement to try to get Iran to make a deal. But this is also dangerous because if Iran calls his bluff, then he's forced to act.
I see. And Trump also says the deal with Iran could still happen. Is Iran likely to engage in negotiations anytime soon, do you think?
Well, there's been some mixed signaling about this. So, you know, there have been some in the government that are clearly looking for an off-ramp to de-escalate, but then there are other more hardliners that want to hunker down and fight it out. You know, last night there were reports that Steve Witkoff spoke with the Iranian foreign minister again about a new offer to find a diplomatic end to the crisis. But Iran is demanding an end to Israeli bombing in order to restart negotiations. Foreign Minister Arirang is also planning on meeting the foreign ministers of the UK, Great Britain, UK, France, and Germany today in Geneva. You know, so there is willingness to negotiate, but it's contingent on the end of Israeli bombing, and that's going to be a tough sell to Israel. You know, for Israel to stop bombing, stop their campaign, I think that they're going to have guarantees of a maximalist negotiation strategy from the U.S.
Right, and President Trump also claims Iran was weeks away from having nuclear weapons. So in your view, how close is Iran to getting an actual nuclear weapon?
Well, they're certainly set back now, but you know, even as of late March, the U.S. intelligence assessment was that Iran was not building a bomb, but it had enriched significant amounts of uranium closer to breakout levels. Now, the May IAEA report indicated that Iran had enriched enough uranium to 60%, which is just a technical step away from the 90% necessary for a weapon, for 9 nuclear bombs. They also found man-made uranium particles in 3 undeclared sites. So there's a question of intent that looms over the subject. As far as I understand the threat, Iran has been at a near zero breakout for a long time, for a matter of months, and there's been no change in that. There's no open source intelligence or compelling evidence that I've seen to show any change in that trajectory. But according to Israel, they have developed a program to weaponize its enriched uranium. And in the last week, for whatever reason, Donald Trump has decided to believe them.
See, and surely the fighting can't go on forever. How might this conflict end and when?
Yeah. Well, the end game is the biggest question. I think it probably hinges on 3 factors. The U.S. decision to engage militarily or not, Israel's strategic goals, and Iran's willingness to negotiate. So if the U.S. gets directly involved, Iran could retaliate by hitting U.S. forces in the region, closing the Straits of Hormuz, or attacking regional energy infrastructure, which would likely lead to a U.S. retaliation and escalation. On the other hand, it seems like the U.S. is looking for a negotiated end to this. Last night's conversation between Witkoff and Arakchi and President Trump's announcement that he's going to make a decision in the next 2 weeks indicate that they're trying to find a different solution. Israel's strategic goals, their tactical achievements are already pretty significant, but the strategic goals may not be met if the Fordo complex remains operational and the government stays intact, because I think that they'll presume the government will now rush to a bomb. So the question is going to be, when will Israel be willing to step back and say that they've accomplished enough? Regarding Iran's willingness to negotiate, you're right, the fighting can't go on forever, but Iran is notoriously patient, and I think that they'll try to test Israel's will. Ayatollah Khamenei is notorious for his belief that kind of backing down in the face of pressure shows weakness, and it kind of invites domestic unrest. So, he'll be defiant. On the other hand, he wants to survive. They have a long history of prioritizing regime security, and he wants the regime to survive after he passes. So negotiators are going to have to kind of carefully navigate this delicate duality of the supreme leader's instincts moving forward. As far as when goes, I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think the when is completely dependent on the how.
See, I guess we'll have to see how it goes. All right, Dr. Lawrence, thank you so much for your insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.